In the 1980s and 1990s, I was involved primarily with the continent of Africa and with work on children. And I watched, almost with disbelief, the incalculable damage that was done by the international financial institutions, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, the damage that was done to a number of African countries as they struggled in the post-independence period for economic and social and financial integrity. And those were the days of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and Brian Mulroney, and they embraced a particular ideological perspective which was tremendously damaging. They actually gave it a name. They called it structural adjustment programs. And when any of the beleaguered developing countries needed a loan, the bank or the International Monetary Fund would say to them, "We'll give you the money, but we're attaching conditions." And the conditions ranged right across the board. They would say to these countries, "You're not allowed to grow food for your own people anymore. You're only allowed to grow cash crops that can be exported, like coffee and cocoa, so that you can accumulate money by way of foreign exchange. And you're not allowed to have any deficits. You've got to have a balanced budget at all times. And above all, we're going to insist that you apply user fees where there were never user fees before. So if people have to go to a local health center, clinic, or hospital, you're going to force them to pay for it. And if kids want to go to school, they're going to have to pay school fees, which was unheard of in most of the countries. And it's worth, as a matter of reflection, thinking that millions of children on the continent of Africa in particular were denied access to school because they couldn't afford the school fees, they couldn't afford the uniforms, they couldn't afford the notebooks. And all of this was imposed on them by the most damnably perverse international financial construct called structural adjustment programs. And it did terrible damage to the social sectors, to health, to education, to agriculture, to water, to sanitation. It just stripped them. It gave primacy to some of the fiscal realities, but it paid no attention whatsoever to the human condition. And to this very day, countries of Africa have never recovered. I mean, people have very perverse and pejorative views, often dismissive, often contemptuous of the African continent, and there are countries which deserve contempt. But for most of those countries, they're still reeling from the consequences of the perverse financial policies which were imposed on them by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And those social sectors which make life worthwhile, which is what you collectively do, regardless of whether it's community recreation on the one hand, health and education on the other, municipal infrastructure, it's what gives meaning to life. That's what you're engaged in. All of that was stripped bare in country after country.